Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
Hi Reddit, I'm Andrew, 38, and I've always tried to do right by my family. But lately, I've been realizing that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't earn you respect, it earns you ridicule. My story starts with my daughter, Lila, who just turned 19. She's always been responsible, hardworking, and surprisingly patient for her age. Since she was 16, she's worked part-time jobs, saved every penny, and never once asked me or my ex-wife for money beyond the basics. Watching her grow up, I wanted her to know that hard work pays off, and sometimes you have to step in to make sure that effort is recognized. Now, my parents, Helen and Richard, have never been subtle about their favoritism. It's always been there, lurking under polite smiles at family gatherings or bubbling up during casual conversations. My nephew, Mason, my sister's son, was always the talented one in their eyes. If he got a B in school, it was because he tried so hard. But if Lila got an A, it was just her usual, predictable perfection. Honestly, I never let it bother me too much, because I figured they were just old-fashioned and stuck in their ways. But when it started affecting my daughter directly, I realized I couldn't just brush it off anymore. A few months ago, Lila had her heart set on a car she could afford on her own, and after seeing how hard she'd worked, I decided to help her in a way that wouldn't take away from her accomplishment. I gave her a small contribution to make the purchase realistic, not a handout, just a little boost so she could reach the finish line faster. When I told my parents about it at a Sunday dinner, their reactions were exactly what I feared. Helen's smile didn't reach her eyes, and Richard let out this exaggerated sigh like I'd just committed a crime. "You spent how much on her? She should be learning the value of money," my dad said, shaking his head. I tried to explain that Lila had earned the car mostly on her own and that my contribution was more symbolic than substantial. But before I could finish, Helen cut in, voice sharp and almost gleeful. "Oh, Andrew, you really shouldn't. Mason could have used that more. He's our little genius, you know." I paused, unsure if she was joking. But no, she wasn't. Mason, who had spent the last year whining about wanting the latest video games and complaining whenever his allowance wasn't increased, was somehow more deserving of a car Lila had been saving for herself. Lila's face, which had been glowing with pride just a moment before, fell. I could see the hurt in her eyes, the flicker of shame she didn't deserve. I wanted to snap, to yell, to defend her, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I smiled, kept my voice calm, and said, "She worked hard for this, just like Mason worked hard for his things. Everyone earns their own way, don't they?" The words were polite, measured, but inside, I was boiling. My parents didn't even flinch. Helen gave me a thin-lipped smile and said, "Well, if you insist. I just think it's a shame when the right people don't get rewarded." And with that, they moved on, pretending nothing had happened, leaving Lila and me sitting there, stiff with tension. After that night, I started noticing a pattern I hadn't fully realized before. It wasn't just about the car, it was about every choice I made for Lila. Clothes she bought, courses she excelled in, little achievements like winning a local writing contest, all were subject to their judgment. And every time, Mason was held up as the golden example, no matter how minor his accomplishments. I began to feel a mix of anger, frustration, and a creeping realization that my parents' disapproval wasn't going to fade. It was going to escalate. I tried to shield Lila from it at first. I'd tell her, "Ignore them. You know your worth, and I know it too." But kids are perceptive, and she could feel it. She started asking questions in that quiet, hesitant way kids have when they're trying not to hurt anyone's feelings, but still need answers. "Dad, why don't Grandma and Grandpa ever seem happy for me?" she asked one evening while we were making dinner together. Her words cut deeper than any argument could. I hugged her close and said, "Sometimes, people can't see what's right in front of them. That's their problem, not yours." Even then, I underestimated how far their entitlement and bias would go. A few weeks later, I invited my parents over for Lila's birthday. I wanted them to see her independence and growth, to maybe spark a little pride. I thought it would be a gentle reminder that she was her own person and that I wasn't afraid to support her achievements. Big mistake. Helen immediately commented on Lila's gift, a brand new car key fob she was holding, still wrapped in the little velvet pouch I'd given her. "Oh, Andrew, you really didn't have to. Mason could have used a car like this," she said, her voice a dangerous mix of mockery and disappointment. Lila looked at me, trying not to cry, and I could feel my patience snapping. But I didn't let it. I smiled, gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, and said nothing. Instead, I spent the rest of the evening watching their thinly veiled disapproval, the way they looked at Lila like she had broken some unspoken rule by being competent and responsible. And that's when I realized something important. This wasn't just a little favoritism. This was a pattern, a deeply ingrained entitlement that wouldn't be fixed with polite words. That night, after they left, Lila and I sat on the porch in the fading sunlight. She leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "I wish they could see me for me, Dad." I swallowed hard, heart aching, but also a little spark ignited inside me. If they couldn't appreciate her now, then maybe it was time they saw the life she could create for herself, the kind of life they could never provide. It was a subtle thought at first, almost a daydream. But over the next few weeks, it grew into something sharper, more focused. I started imagining scenarios where their disapproval would be met not with words, but with undeniable truth, where they couldn't laugh or mock because the reality would be so clear, so visible, that there would be no room left for their entitlement. I knew it wouldn't happen overnight, and it wouldn't be easy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that some form of poetic justice was coming. Things started to get worse after Lila's birthday. At first, it was little things that could be brushed off, comments during phone calls, offhand remarks during visits. But slowly, the small cracks began to widen into chasms. My parents didn't even try to hide it anymore. It was as if the pretense of civility had been stripped away, leaving pure judgment in its place. Every phone call with them became a test of patience, every family dinner a battlefield. Lila noticed too, and I could see it in the way she hesitated before telling me about her day, the subtle deflation of her usually confident posture. One Saturday afternoon, Lila had a part-time shift at a small local boutique, something she'd been doing for almost a year. She was saving for college books, extra tuition costs, and honestly, the car she'd worked for herself. She was still paying off the loan even with my small help. I had come to the shop to surprise her, just to see her face light up when I walked in. But instead of joy, the first thing she said was a quiet, almost guilty, "Dad, maybe you shouldn't have come." Confused, I asked why, and she hesitated, twisting the hem of her apron nervously. Finally, she muttered, "Grandma and Grandpa called me earlier. They said I should quit. That the hours I'm working are a waste of time because Mason deserves the car more. That I'm selfish for trying to get ahead without waiting for them to bless me." I froze. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity. Part of me wanted to scream, and the larger, heavier part of me felt my chest tighten in that peculiar parental blend of rage and sorrow. Lila looked at me, hoping I wouldn't be angry at her for telling me this, and I realized how much she'd been carrying this weight silently. Did Mason say this?" I asked, incredulous. She shook her head. "No, it was them. I didn't even answer most of it. I just left the phone." I could feel my jaw tighten. My parents had crossed a line. They weren't just criticizing from afar. They were trying to interfere with my daughter's life, her independence, her sense of accomplishment. And for what? Some imagined entitlement toward my nephew, who had yet to show even a fraction of the work ethic Lila had. That weekend, we decided to go out to lunch as a family, just Lila and me, away from the tension at home. I wanted to hear her talk about her dreams, not about her family's manipulation. But of course, no good deed goes unpunished. Halfway through the meal, my phone buzzed with a text from Helen. "We need to talk. Lila should be more reasonable. You're spoiling her. Mason deserves a chance too." I felt my hand clench around the napkin. "She's working for everything she has," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. Lila squeezed my hand, silently agreeing, and I could see that even at 19, she was learning the early lessons of frustration and injustice. But I also saw something else, quiet determination. It was the same spark that had made me confident I could guide her toward success despite my parents' nonsense. As the months went on, the favoritism intensified. Mason began to brag openly to his parents about small, trivial achievements, getting a promotion at a summer camp job, buying a slightly nicer gaming console than last year, and Helen and Richard would respond with effusive praise. Meanwhile, Lila's accomplishments were greeted with thin smiles, raised eyebrows, or outright dismissal. It wasn't just words anymore. At one family barbecue, Lila had brought her savings account statement to show she'd reached a milestone in her goal for the car. I was proud. She had done it entirely on her own, and I wanted her parents to see it, even if they didn't care. Helen glanced at it, pursed her lips, and said, "Well, it's nice you managed to save something. Mason could have done that too, you know, if he wanted to." Richard nodded, adding, "Yeah, she should be sharing some of that with her cousin. That's only fair." Lila's face went pale, and I felt a protective surge in me that I could barely control. I opened my mouth to tell them off, but she put a hand on mine. She didn't want me to fight. She just wanted me to see that she could handle herself. And she had, quietly turning away and walking off with a polite, "Thanks for looking, but I've got this." It was then I realized they were actively trying to sabotage her sense of self-worth, and the worst part was they were using me as a tool or a shield. They wanted me to feel guilty for supporting her independence, to feel like I was undermining their authority as grandparents. The tipping point came during Lila's high school graduation. She had worked tirelessly, balancing multiple jobs and AP courses, and had earned honors recognition. I had never been prouder. Naturally, I wanted to celebrate her accomplishment in a way that reflected how much she had achieved, without my parents' shadow looming over it. I booked a small private dinner at a restaurant she loved, invited close family friends, and made sure Lila knew this night was about her. But, predictably, my parents showed up unannounced. Helen was holding Mason by the hand, beaming, and Richard had this smug, satisfied look that immediately set my nerves on edge. They weren't just going to watch, they were going to compete. "Mason worked hard too," Helen said, cutting across the polite introductions. "I don't see why he shouldn't be recognized in the same way." "Mom, Dad, this is Lila's night," I said, my voice tight but controlled. "Oh, Andrew, we're just here to show support," Richard replied, smirking. But the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mason, oblivious to the real weight of the situation, kept talking about how he'd deserved a bigger gift for graduation and how Lila should just let him have a turn for once. I felt my blood pressure rise. I could see the hurt building in Lila's eyes again, that same flicker of frustration and disbelief I had seen before. And then it happened, the thing that pushed the situation from bad to catastrophic. Helen, in front of the entire restaurant, leaned toward the waiter and said, loud enough for most of the room to hear, "Could you bring Mason the deluxe car model? Oh, and maybe something small for Lila. She doesn't need much. She's already got that car her father spoiled her with." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My parents weren't just dismissing Lila's hard work. They were actively sabotaging her celebration, turning a milestone meant to honor her into a display of favoritism for Mason. The waiter froze, glancing between Lila, me, and Helen, unsure how to proceed. My stomach churned. Lila's face drained of color, her hands gripping the tablecloth so hard her knuckles turned white. In that moment, I realized two things. One, my parents didn't see Lila as an individual. They saw her as a rival to be minimized, a reflection of their skewed priorities. And two, their entitlement had reached a level where nothing I did or said could make them understand what was fair or right. They had crossed a line, not just emotionally, but publicly, in front of witnesses, in a way that humiliated my daughter and undermined every ounce of her effort. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. I could argue, I could confront them, I could walk out, but I knew none of that would matter right now. I had to stay calm, keep Lila steady, and let the moment pass without letting them see how much power they thought they had over us. But deep inside, a storm was brewing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As Helen and Richard continued their quiet commentary, the waiter returned, awkwardly placing a small dessert in front of Lila and a lavish display in front of Mason. Lila's eyes welled up, and I could feel the heat of anger and shame rising in me. I held her hand under the table, squeezing it as if to tell her silently, "I see you. I've got you. This will not define you." And then, as Mason grinned like he had won some invisible game, I felt it. The moment of clarity that would define everything moving forward. This wasn't just a family feud. This was a full-on battle for Lila's independence, her dignity, and her right to be celebrated for her own hard work. And the realization hit me. To protect her and give her the recognition she deserved, I couldn't just fight politely. I would have to plan, wait, and execute in a way that left no room for their entitlement to overshadow her. That night, after the guests left and we were finally alone, Lila curled up next to me on the couch, exhausted and frustrated. I wrapped my arms around her and whispered, "They don't get to define your worth. Not now, not ever. You're going to drive past them one day, and they'll see exactly what they failed to give you." She looked up at me, eyes wide but trusting, and nodded. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. The groundwork for their downfall was being laid. I just had to wait for the right time to strike. After that disastrous graduation dinner, I spent a few days in a kind of stunned silence. Lila was fine on the surface. She threw herself into work and school like she always did, but I could tell she was simmering with frustration. I was too. That sense of helplessness, of watching someone you love being belittled by the very people who should be supporting her, weighed on me more heavily than I'd expected. I found myself replaying every interaction with my parents over the past few months, every slight, every dismissive comment, and feeling a slow burn of anger. For a brief moment, I even wondered if I'd failed as a parent. Was I too lenient with Lila? Had I underestimated how cruel my parents could be? That thought gnawed at me, and I could feel it settle in the pit of my stomach like a heavy stone. But then I'd see Lila, confident in her quiet way, holding her head high even when she felt small, and I realized something. The problem wasn't us. The problem was them. My parents were the problem. And if we were going to rise above their entitlement, we'd have to find our own path forward. The next few weeks were a mixture of subtle withdrawal and careful planning. I couldn't confront them head-on without things escalating further, and I certainly couldn't allow their negativity to poison Lila's growth. So I started quietly shifting my focus. I helped Lila create a budget, but not just any budget. One that allowed her to see exactly how much she was earning, saving, and investing. She was already disciplined, but I wanted her to feel in control, to see tangible progress from her hard work. I'd sit with her some nights, spreadsheets open on the dining table, going line by line, teaching her the small things about money that weren't taught in school. And she thrived. Within a few months, Lila had managed to save a substantial portion of her next car's payment entirely on her own. She began looking at small investments, researching them on her own, and even started freelancing some graphic design work for local businesses. Each time she came to me with a new idea, a new milestone, I felt a surge of pride that was almost intoxicating. It was like watching her blossom into her own person, completely independent of their judgment, and it gave me a quiet satisfaction that no amount of ridicule could touch. Meanwhile, I was quietly building my own momentum. I had always been reasonably successful in my career, but I realized I had been coasting, letting the day-to-day grind dominate my focus. After graduation, I threw myself into expanding my consulting business, taking on higher-profile clients, networking more aggressively, and investing in areas I'd been hesitant about before. It was an instant success. It never is. But I could feel the tide turning. I was finally creating a life that wasn't dictated by their opinions or their approval, and that feeling of self-determination was invigorating. Of course, my parents had no idea. They continued their routine of passive-aggressive comments and comparisons. Every time Lila visited them, or worse, every time Mason bragged about something trivial, they would find a way to let it sting. I learned to let it slide, keeping my cool even when Helen said things like, "I don't see why she's so proud of that little car. Mason's next purchase will be so much more impressive." Or when Richard commented, "You really spoil her, Andrew. One day she'll expect the world handed to her." Every time, I reminded myself that this wasn't a battle to be fought in words. This was a long game. I had to keep building, keep rising, keep letting Lila flourish so that when the time came, the contrast would be undeniable. And she was rising. She applied for and won a scholarship to a local university, an opportunity she had earned purely on merit. She started volunteering at a community center, mentoring younger students, and even started a small online shop for custom designs. Her confidence grew in leaps and bounds, and I noticed her posture changing. She no longer flinched when my parents made a snide remark. She simply smiled politely, confident in the knowledge of her own accomplishments. It was around this time that I had a subtle realization. Part of the reason my parents were so unrelenting was that they had grown used to power, the kind of power that comes from being in the position to judge, to approve, to control. They thrived on it. And if I wanted to protect Lila, I needed to strip that power from them in the most understated but undeniable way possible. I began making small, strategic moves. I invited Lila to exclusive events with me, networking dinners, charity galas, business expos, places where she could meet people outside our family bubble and start building a reputation that wasn't tied to my parents' biased lens. Each event was carefully chosen to showcase her abilities, intelligence, and charm without overtly flaunting it, because subtlety would sting more than overt confrontation. The real breakthrough came when Lila received an unexpected opportunity. One of her freelance clients, a small but growing design studio, offered her a part-time contract that could turn into a full-time position after graduation. It was the kind of opportunity she had dreamed about, one that would allow her to build a career while continuing her education. I could see the excitement and pride in her eyes, the kind that can't be faked or diminished. And I realized that if we could just get a few more milestones like this, if we could build a visible trail of success, my parents' entitlement would become not just annoying but irrelevant. Around that time, I started documenting everything, not obsessively, but carefully. Photos of Lila at work, screenshots of her growing online business, letters of acceptance and awards, her savings milestones, all little pieces of proof that she was succeeding on her own terms. I wasn't doing this to prove a point to anyone yet. I was doing it to preserve the story of her achievements, to remind both of us that no amount of criticism could erase what she had built with her own hands. But then came the most crushing moment, the one that made everything real. One evening, after Lila had been working late on a project for a client, I got a call from a mutual acquaintance, someone I trusted implicitly, who told me that Helen had been spreading lies about Lila behind our backs. Lies designed to make her look incompetent, irresponsible, and unworthy of her achievements. Apparently, Helen had been telling people that Lila's car wasn't really hers, that she had hardly contributed anything, and that I had simply bought everything for her to make Mason look bad. I felt a wave of disbelief, anger, and disbelief all at once. How could they be so petty, so manipulative, so determined to undermine someone they supposedly loved? It wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was active sabotage, a betrayal of trust that cut deeper than anything else. I remember sitting on the couch that night, Lila asleep in her room, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything. Her hard work, their cruelty, the frustration of knowing that no amount of explaining or defending would make them see reason. But as the anger settled into a quiet, simmering resolve, something shifted. I realized that their efforts to diminish her only highlighted her strength. The more they tried to tear her down, the higher she climbed. I made a silent promise to myself, and to her, that we would not just survive this, we would thrive, and they would watch everything they denied her unfold right before their eyes. I knew it wouldn't happen overnight. I knew it would take patience, strategy, and restraint. But for the first time, I felt truly in control. In the weeks that followed, I started noticing small changes in Lila's demeanor. She walked taller, smiled brighter, and no longer flinched when she heard her parents' names mentioned. She had internalized the lesson I had been teaching her, that validation doesn't have to come from those who refuse to give it. She began taking risks she wouldn't have dared before, applying for competitions, pitching ideas to bigger clients, and investing even more time and effort into her online business. And through it all, I stayed by her side, quietly guiding, quietly supporting, quietly building a foundation that would one day leave no room for doubt. Meanwhile, my parents were oblivious to what was happening right under their noses. They continued to talk about Mason as though he were the paragon of achievement, while dismissing everything Lila had accomplished. Each time I heard their voices in passing, I felt the faint thrill of anticipation, because every snide remark, every belittling comment, every misguided boast about Mason was just another step on the ladder that Lila and I were quietly climbing, out of sight, out of mind. until the moment we chose to reveal everything. By the time Lila turned 20, she was on the cusp of something extraordinary. Her business had grown significantly. Her freelance clients respected her skill and professionalism, and her savings were approaching a level that would allow her to upgrade her car entirely without any help from me or anyone else. I could see the moment approaching when all their judgment, all their favoritism, all their petty entitlement would collide with the undeniable reality of what she had achieved on her own. By the time Lila turned 21, it was clear that everything we had quietly built was approaching a tipping point. Her confidence had grown in ways that even I hadn't anticipated. She no longer hesitated to speak up in meetings, to assert her value to clients, or to demand fair pay for her work. Her small online business had blossomed into a fully functional shop with regular commissions, repeat customers, and even partnerships with other small creators in town. Every time I saw her packing orders, balancing spreadsheets, or mentoring younger freelancers, I felt a quiet pride that bordered on awe. Meanwhile, my parents continued their pattern of entitlement, completely unaware of the storm gathering quietly right under their noses. Helen had taken to casually posting on social media about Mason's successes, while Richard sent me thinly veiled notes about how I was letting Lila think she was better than her cousin. They were so wrapped up in their own illusions of power that they didn't see the real achievements being quietly documented and compiled by both Lila and me. It was around this time that I began thinking seriously about the eventual reveal. I knew it couldn't be impulsive. I couldn't simply show up with a brag or a list of accomplishments and expect them to be humbled. It needed to be undeniable, public, and impossible to dismiss. That meant meticulous planning. I began outlining a strategy that would showcase Lila's independence, intelligence, and hard work in a way that would hit them where it hurt, their pride. The first step was gathering allies, not in a manipulative sense, but in the sense of building a visible network of people who respected and valued Lila's talent. I reached out to some of her freelance clients, gently asking if they would be willing to provide testimonials, endorsements, or even attend a small event we could host. To my delight, they were enthusiastic. Lila's professionalism and skill had earned her genuine admiration, and people were more than willing to support her. These weren't just words. They were reputations, networks, and tangible evidence of her success. Next, I began carefully selecting the right moments to subtly escalate visibility. I didn't want to humiliate my parents unnecessarily, at least not yet. I wanted them to feel the creeping awareness that their favoritism and entitlement didn't matter anymore. So we started small. Lila began posting occasional updates about her freelance work, not ostentatiously, just informative and professional, while I continued to expand my consulting business. Little by little, the number of people aware of her achievements grew, and with it, the credibility and weight of her accomplishments. Meanwhile, I continued to observe my parents' behavior. Their entitlement was escalating, almost predictably. Helen started making more pointed comments about Mason, highlighting trivial achievements as if they were groundbreaking, while Richard kept reminding me of what a mistake it was to spoil Lila with anything, whether material or emotional. Each remark, each brag, only solidified my resolve to make sure they saw exactly what they were missing out on. One afternoon, a casual conversation with a former colleague sparked an idea that would become the centerpiece of the plan. I was talking to Greg, an old business partner, about the growth of Lila's freelance work when he casually said, "Have you thought about putting together a showcase? You know, a small exhibition of her designs? People love seeing the story behind the work, not just the product." That was it, the perfect opportunity. A public event, carefully curated to highlight Lila's achievements, her independence, and the skills she had honed through years of hard work. I didn't say anything in the moment, but the idea planted itself firmly in my mind. This could be done with elegance, professionalism, and, most importantly, undeniable impact. Over the next several weeks, Lila and I began laying the groundwork. We reached out to clients and friends, arranging for displays, testimonials, and even a small media presence to give the event legitimacy. We planned the details meticulously, the timing, the invitations, the presentations. It had to be flawless. Lila would be the star, and the event itself would serve as proof that her accomplishments were real, substantial, and entirely of her own making. Meanwhile, I made subtle adjustments in my own life to ensure that the contrast with my parents' expectations would be stark. I upgraded my consulting firm's online presence, refined our branding, and positioned myself to appear as the supportive yet successful father who had quietly empowered his daughter. Every email, every social media post, every minor public appearance was carefully considered to reinforce the narrative without ever tipping my hand. Through it all, Lila was remarkable. She was calm, composed, and determined. She understood the stakes without me needing to spell them out. Together, we created not just a showcase of her achievements, but a story of resilience, diligence, and independence. It wasn't about revenge in the petty sense. It was about making reality undeniable, so that when the time came, my parents' entitlement and favoritism would be exposed simply by observing the life Lila had built for herself. Even as we worked, the tension with my parents continued to build. Helen had started making veiled threats during calls, implying that Mason would never forgive us if he didn't get the recognition she believed he deserved. Richard sent cryptic texts questioning why Lila was spending so much time on freelance work instead of focusing on the right things. I kept my responses polite, neutral, and careful, never giving away that I was aware of their growing irritation. The more they tried to exert control, the more obvious it became that their efforts were futile. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when we secured a small venue for the event. It wasn't extravagant, but it was professional and intimate, just enough to create an air of prestige. Invitations went out to clients, friends, and local media contacts. We arranged for a live demonstration of Lila's work, a showcase of her design process, and even a brief presentation about her journey, emphasizing the hard work, dedication, and independence that had brought her to this point. By the week of the event, the anticipation was almost palpable. Lila was glowing with confidence, her excitement barely contained. I could see the transformation clearly now. She was no longer the quiet, hesitant girl who had once flinched at her grandparents' remarks. She was a force, a young woman whose accomplishments demanded recognition and whose self-worth was unshakable. I, too, felt a surge of quiet power. This wasn't about me or proving my parents wrong for the sake of it. It was about demonstrating that nurturing and supporting someone's independence could yield results far beyond what entitlement or favoritism ever could. And I knew, deep down, that when the day came, my parents would see everything laid bare. They would have no words, no excuses, no clever rationalizations left. But even as the plan solidified, there was an edge of tension that I couldn't ignore. I had spent months carefully curating every detail, ensuring that Lila's rise was undeniable, that every element of the showcase would highlight her achievements. Yet I also knew that my parents were unpredictable, capable of behavior that could potentially sabotage the event if given the chance. I began thinking of contingencies, subtle ways to ensure that their presence couldn't interfere, ways to guide the experience without overt manipulation. By the night before the showcase, everything was in place. The invitations had been sent, the venue arranged, the displays perfected. Lila had rehearsed her presentation, checked every design sample, and confirmed every detail with the clients and allies who would be attending. I could see the nervous excitement in her eyes, a mixture of anticipation and pride. And as I watched her, I realized something profound. This moment wasn't just about revenge or proving a point. It was about justice in the form of recognition, the kind that couldn't be disputed or diminished. I went to bed that night feeling a strange mix of exhilaration and anxiety. Tomorrow would be the day everything we had worked toward collided with the reality of my parents' entitlement. I knew they would show up, as they always did, expecting to assert control or belittle Lila's accomplishments. But this time, there would be no room for mockery, no opportunity to dismiss her hard work. The reality of her achievements would be on full display, undeniable and undeniable in a way that would leave them speechless. And yet, even in the quiet darkness of that night, I felt a flicker of doubt, because with such meticulous planning came the risk of exposure, the risk that my parents might sense the stakes and try to manipulate the situation. I went over the plan in my head, step by step, imagining every possible scenario, every possible response. And as I did, I realized that the suspense, the tension, the anticipation were all part of the journey. By the time the sun rose, everything was set. The stage was built, the story framed, the allies prepared. Lila and I were ready. Not for confrontation, not for drama, but for the undeniable truth to be revealed. The moment we had been building toward for months, the moment that would finally show my parents what they had failed to give, was within reach. The day of the showcase arrived, and everything was in place. Lila was radiant, not in a flashy way, but in the quiet, undeniable glow of someone who had earned every ounce of her confidence and independence. The venue, a modest but elegant gallery space we had rented downtown, was arranged perfectly. Each table displayed her work, her design process, her growth over the past several years. Clients had left testimonials framed next to each piece, and a small stage had been set up for her presentation. The air was thick with anticipation, but also with the satisfaction of careful preparation. I could see the tension radiating off my parents the moment they arrived. Helen and Richard walked in like they owned the place, Mason trailing behind, grinning and whispering to them like he was in on some private joke. Their eyes quickly landed on Lila, who stood near the front, smiling politely at guests and chatting confidently with clients. They immediately tried to mask their surprise with their usual thin-lipped smiles, but the flicker of confusion, maybe even apprehension, in Helen's eyes didn't go unnoticed. "Andrew, what is all this?" Helen demanded, her voice tight, trying to assert authority. "Is this Lila's project? It looks very professional." "Yes, Mom. It's hers," I said, calmly, making no effort to hide the satisfaction in my tone. "Everything here is her work, her ideas, her designs, her effort. I just helped her bring it to this stage." Richard's mouth opened, then closed, as he tried to think of a clever retort but failed. Mason, who had been beaming moments earlier, looked confused, clearly realizing that this wasn't just another casual brag about him or his supposed accomplishments. The first part of the showcase was a casual walkthrough. Guests, clients, and friends moved through the displays, asking Lila questions about her process, her techniques, and her inspirations. Each answer she gave was articulate, insightful, and completely her own. I watched as the realization began to dawn on my parents. This wasn't some hobby, some minor project. They were witnessing her skill, her intelligence, and her independence in a tangible, undeniable form. Helen's attempts to interject fell flat. Every time she tried to comment, Lila's confidence and clarity made her irrelevant. Richard tried to smile and nod, as if acknowledging the work without giving it proper credit, but his eyes betrayed him. Mason hovered nearby, awkwardly holding a plate of refreshments, unsure what to do. For the first time, he didn't look like the golden child. He looked small, insignificant, and completely unremarkable next to Lila's achievements. Then came the centerpiece, Lila's presentation. She walked onto the small stage, the gallery lights focused on her, and began explaining her journey, the hours of work, the sacrifices, the long nights balancing school and freelance clients, and the persistence that had brought her here. She spoke not with anger or resentment, but with quiet pride and undeniable authority. Each word highlighted her independence, her skill, and the reality that every milestone she had achieved was the result of her own effort, not someone else's handout. I watched Helen and Richard's expressions shift, subtly at first, then more dramatically. Helen's lips parted as if to protest, then closed again, trapped by the weight of truth. Richard's jaw tightened, and I could see the slow sinking feeling of realization, the understanding that every dismissive comment, every snide remark, every favoring of Mason had not just failed to diminish Lila, but had made her victories even sweeter in contrast. When Lila finished, the room erupted in applause. People were genuinely impressed, genuinely inspired. Clients left compliments that were sincere, visitors shook her hand, and even some local journalists who had been invited for coverage made comments about her professionalism and determination. It was a crescendo of validation that my parents couldn't argue with, even if they wanted to. Then came the subtle but deliberate reveal. As part of the event, I had prepared a small slideshow of her achievements, her freelance projects, her savings milestones, letters of recommendation, scholarship acceptances, and screenshots of client feedback. Each slide told the story of her independence and work ethic, painting a complete picture of someone who had earned every success entirely on her own. Helen gasped, audibly this time, and Richard's face went pale. Mason's smile faltered completely. The room was filled with admiration for Lila, but more importantly, it was a room full of witnesses. They couldn't dismiss this. They couldn't claim favoritism or entitlement. Every accomplishment was documented, undeniable, and undeniable in a way that left no room for debate. After the slideshow, I walked up beside Lila and addressed the room, carefully choosing my words so that everyone could hear. Lila has achieved all of this through her own effort, her dedication, and her resilience. She's an example of what can be accomplished when someone is allowed to pursue their goals without undue interference or entitlement. We're proud of her, and I wanted to share her success with everyone who has supported her journey. I glanced at my parents. Helen's mouth opened and closed several times, as though she was trying to form a sentence that could explain away the undeniable truth. Richard looked like he might faint, and Mason's gaze dropped to the floor. For the first time in years, the hierarchy my parents had tried to impose was gone, replaced by the undeniable reality of Lila's achievements. The evening ended with congratulations from everyone, handshakes, hugs, and genuine admiration. Helen and Richard left quietly, uncharacteristically subdued. They didn't speak to me or Lila on the way out. Mason followed them, shoulders slumped, probably realizing that the world hadn't revolved around him the way he thought it did. When the door closed behind them, I finally let out a deep breath. Lila turned to me, her eyes shining with pride and relief. "We did it," she whispered, barely containing her emotion. "Yes, we did," I said, pulling her into a hug. "And this is just the beginning. You've built a foundation they'll never take away from you." For the next few days, my parents attempted a few weak attempts at contact. Helen sent texts complimenting the presentation, but the tone was hollow, almost apologetic in a way that revealed her shame. Richard called, trying to reclaim some semblance of authority, but I responded politely, firmly, and without emotion. I made it clear that their opinions no longer carried weight in our lives, and that Lila's accomplishments were hers to enjoy, independent of them. The most satisfying part was watching them adjust to a new reality. They had spent decades believing they controlled the narrative of our family, that their favoritism and entitlement could overshadow anyone else's success. And now, they were forced to witness the truth. Lila's success wasn't given, it was earned. Their attempts to control or diminish her had backfired spectacularly, and the full weight of that failure was undeniable. A week later, I drove Lila to the boutique where she had started her first freelance gig. She parked her upgraded car, fully paid for with her savings, her business earnings, and the small help I had given her early on, right in front of the store. Mason happened to be there with Helen and Richard, who were visiting the neighborhood for some trivial errand. Lila looked up, recognized them, and drove past with a confident wave. I could see the shock on their faces, the disbelief that the life they had refused to provide had been built entirely by the person they had tried to dismiss. As we drove away, Lila turned to me, smiling with that same quiet pride that had fueled every step of her journey. "They'll get over it," she said softly. "No," I replied, matching her grin. "They won't. Not this time." And that's exactly the point. For the first time in years, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. Lila had risen above their entitlement, above their favoritism, and above their petty attempts to control her life. She was thriving, independent, and unshakably confident. And my parents, who had spent so long trying to define her worth, were left powerless witnesses to a reality they could neither influence nor ignore. That night, as Lila recounted the reactions of the neighborhood and her clients, I realized something profound. Revenge wasn't about humiliation or cruelty. It was about truth, fairness, and letting reality speak louder than entitlement ever could. Lila had earned every inch of her success. And this time, everyone saw it. I'm Ryan, 28, and I've spent most of my life quietly trying to prove that I'm not invisible in my own family. My dad's retirement party should have been a joyful celebration, a night where the whole family could relax and enjoy themselves after decades of him working tirelessly. Instead, it turned into a vivid reminder that, In their eyes, I've always been the background noise while my younger brother Ethan got all the spotlight. My family has a way of making accomplishments feel like personal property. Ethan, 25, somehow manages to make everything he does look effortless, and my parents, and most of the extended family, cling to that as evidence that he's the real success in the family. I've learned to keep my expectations low, but I can't say I don't feel it every time I'm overlooked. The night started off normal enough. The venue was a modest hall in town with fairy lights strung across the ceiling, a long buffet table with Dad's favorite foods, and a bar stocked with everything from beer to sparkling cider. I arrived with my fiancée, Lauren, trying to keep a low profile, already feeling the familiar tightening in my chest as I anticipated the inevitable comparisons and subtle digs. Dad was at the center of it all, shaking hands, hugging old friends, smiling broadly, genuinely happy. I could tell he had no idea the storm that would unfold once everyone raised their glasses. The moment came when the speeches started. Uncle Martin went first, praising Dad for his decades of hard work. He mentioned Ethan casually, as though it was an aside, and my stomach sank a little. "We're so lucky to have Ethan in the family," he said, raising his glass, smiling proudly at my brother, who sat a few seats away, clearly savoring the attention. Applause followed, and my face tightened. It wasn't just the praise. It was the way everyone seemed to accept it as fact, as if Ethan's presence alone was enough to validate our family. I told myself not to react, to stay calm. I had rehearsed this 1,000 times in my head, ways to handle moments like this without losing my dignity. And then came Aunt Marlene. I should have expected it. She's always had a sharp tongue and an uncanny ability to turn every gathering into a subtle battlefield, but the delivery still cut deep. She smirked, tilted her head slightly, and leaned over, loud enough for the people closest to us to hear. "Maybe one day you'll actually achieve something." There it was, the verbal dagger wrapped in false concern. My first instinct was to argue, to throw back a retort that would put her in her place. But I didn't. I just nodded once, my jaw tight, and left without a word, my pride a fragile shell I was trying to protect. Walking out of that hall, I felt a mix of fury, humiliation, and, oddly enough, calm. There's a certain clarity in silence, I realized, especially when dealing with people who thrive on drama and embarrassment. I kept my thoughts private, texting Lauren as we walked to the car, trying to make sense of the intensity of my feelings. "I can't believe she said that," I typed, though I already knew she understood completely. It's always like this with them. I didn't sleep well that night. Even hours later, the words echoed in my mind, and I started to remember all the small ways my family had minimized my achievements over the years. Graduation? Ethan got the praise for being the smart one, even though I had spent late nights helping him study. My first job? It's nice, Ryan, but Ethan could probably do more with his position. Family vacations, holidays, even casual dinner conversations were laced with comparisons that I had quietly endured, always told myself it didn't matter, that my worth wasn't tied to their approval. But tonight, with Marlene's smirk burned into my memory, something inside me shifted. I felt the first flicker of resolve. Then, this morning, the text came from my mom. "You won't believe what happened after you walked out." My heart skipped a beat. Mom rarely texts like this unless it's urgent, unusual, or dramatic, and usually, all three. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling a mix of apprehension and curiosity. I had no idea whether this was going to be a bombshell revelation, more family chaos, or maybe even a moment that could finally tilt the scales. As I sat there with my phone in hand, I realized something important. I've spent years reacting to the chaos my family creates, letting them control the narrative. Tonight, I wouldn't react, I would plan. I didn't know exactly what that meant yet, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a dangerous sense of clarity. I was no longer just Ryan, the quiet one, the background actor in my family's story. Something had shifted, and I could feel the tension building like a storm ready to break. And I knew, deep down, that the events from last night were only the beginning. The morning after Dad's retirement party, I woke up to the glow of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. Mom's text from earlier sat there, waiting for a response. "You won't believe what happened after you walked out." I stared at it for a long moment, unsure whether I wanted to reply immediately or let the suspense gnaw at me. Eventually, curiosity won. I opened it. Your father had a heart-to-heart with Ethan in the kitchen after you left. You should have been there. He practically announced that Ethan is now the man of the house. My chest tightened, an unfamiliar mix of irritation and betrayal making it hard to breathe. Practically announced was an understatement. From what I pieced together, Dad had spent the night praising Ethan nonstop, comparing him to me in ways that made me feel both invisible and inadequate. I tried to shake it off and focus on something else. Lauren had offered to come over for breakfast, so I put on a pot of coffee and leaned against the counter, staring at the steam rising from my mug. I wanted to tell her everything, but even saying the words out loud felt like admitting defeat. Instead, we tried to laugh it off over pancakes, sharing mundane stories about our weeks. But in the back of my mind, the humiliation from the night before replayed like a broken record. The way Aunt Marlene's smirk lingered in my mind made me clench my fists without realizing it. Later that morning, I got an invitation from Dad to join him and Ethan at a small family brunch. At first, I considered ignoring it, but then I remembered the principle I'd been trying to follow for months. Never run from the confrontation, not entirely. Maybe this would be a chance to quietly assert myself, to at least remind them I exist without raising my voice. When I arrived, I could already feel the shift in energy. Ethan was sprawled comfortably on the couch, acting like he owned the place. He always does when Dad is nearby. Mom hovered by the coffee table, pouring drinks and offering praise to Ethan for everything from his choice of shirt to the way he smiled when he handed Dad a napkin. I sat silently in the armchair across from them, my arms crossed, trying not to let my annoyance spill over into words. The first few minutes were deceptively calm. Dad was talking about his retirement plans, and I nodded along, contributing politely when asked a question. Then Ethan, smiling smugly, decided to bring up the party. It was great seeing everyone celebrate you, Dad. And thanks for the shout-out. I mean, for including me in all the planning, he said casually, glancing at me with a look that could only be described as patronizing. I bit back a retort. This was the first time I realized just how deep this favoritism ran, how little it had to do with merit and everything to do with perception and charm. Mom chimed in, of course, piling on without hesitation. Ryan, you should have helped more with the decorations. Ethan and I stayed up all night, making sure everything looked perfect. Her words landed like hammers on my patience. I had helped, but apparently it was invisible because my efforts didn't fit the narrative she and Ethan had already constructed. I wanted to speak up, to remind her that I'd spent hours arranging centerpieces and ironing tablecloths, but I swallowed the words. I didn't want to argue in front of them. Not yet. Not until I had a plan. Then came the breaking point. The moment I knew nothing would be the same again. Dad casually mentioned that he was considering putting Ethan in charge of his new retirement investment portfolio. He's been really responsible lately, Ryan. I think it's time he took on something more substantial. I felt my stomach drop. I had been working in finance for nearly 4 years, building a quiet but solid record. Yet Dad's words made it clear that my efforts were irrelevant in the family hierarchy. Ethan got the opportunities. Ethan got the praise. Ethan got the trust. I clenched my jaw, feeling a heat rising in my chest that bordered on panic and rage. But the moment that truly shattered my composure wasn't even Dad's decision. It was Ethan himself. Thanks, Dad. I'll make sure to take good care of it. You won't regret it. He flashed that infuriatingly self-satisfied grin, the one that had earned him a lifetime of accolades despite doing far less than I ever had. I realized then that I wasn't angry at him exactly. I was angry at the system he had mastered, at the family that let him manipulate every situation to his advantage. Mom noticed my silence and tilted her head, her smile faltering for just a moment before she recovered. Ryan, you're quiet. Are you upset about something? She asked, her voice sharp but not overtly confrontational. I shook my head, but inside I was a storm. No, I'm fine, I said, forcing a calmness I didn't feel. She didn't press further, but the tension in the room was palpable. I could feel Ethan noticing it too. He smirked, probably thinking he had won again without even trying. After brunch, I retreated to my room, needing to process everything. I opened my laptop and started reviewing my finances, my achievements, even my emails from work. I wanted to remind myself that I wasn't worthless, that their favoritism didn't define me. But the reminders only made the sting worse. The fact that my success was private, almost invisible, while Ethan's mediocre accomplishments were celebrated publicly, gnawed at me relentlessly. Later that evening, I got another message from Mom. I read it slowly. Ethan just called. He wants to borrow money for a business idea. I told him you wouldn't mind helping. I already said you'd transfer it. I stared at the text for a long time. My hands shook. Borrow money? For what? He had a full-time job, and yet, in the eyes of this family, I was the default provider, the safety net, the person who existed to prop up Ethan whenever he wanted. I couldn't believe it. I called her immediately. Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Why would you say I'd help him? Did you even ask me? Oh, Ryan, she replied, sounding genuinely puzzled. He called me crying about how he doesn't have enough for the investment. I thought you'd understand and want to help. Your family. I could feel the rage building, but also the cold clarity forming in my mind. Mom, I'm not his bank. I'm not a safety net for every idea he has. You don't get to assume I'll do something because he asked. There was a pause, and then her voice dropped, almost conspiratorially. Well, you don't want to hurt his feelings, do you? And just like that, the weight of everything hit me. Years of favoritism, years of subtle humiliation, every party, every family dinner, every comparison, they were all part of the same pattern. Ethan had learned to exploit it. Mom had learned to exploit it. Even Dad, who I had once believed would defend me, had implicitly given his approval to the hierarchy that placed Ethan above me. The betrayal wasn't just in words anymore. It was in actions, in decisions that assumed my subservience, my compliance, my quiet endurance. I hung up and sat in the dark, the screen of my phone glowing. I felt like a different person than I had that morning, or even yesterday. The calm I had held on to after the retirement party had shattered. What replaced it was not just anger, but determination. Determination to reclaim my dignity, to confront this entrenched system, and to make sure the next time I was ignored, overlooked, or exploited, I would not be silent. That night, I started drafting a list. Not just of grievances, but of every instance where I had been disregarded, every opportunity Ethan had taken that could have been mine, every conversation where my achievements had been minimized or ignored. I wanted clarity, a roadmap, a strategy. For the first time, I didn't feel small. I felt purposeful. The storm that had been building for years was finally coalescing into something actionable. And then, as I sat there typing notes into my journal, Lauren came in and whispered, Ryan, you need to calm down. Don't let them see you boiling over. I nodded, but inside, I knew she didn't fully understand. This wasn't just anger. This was a breaking point. The kind of emotional climax that changes everything, that forces you to decide. Do you stay invisible forever, or do you finally make them see you? I stared at the ceiling, thinking about the next day, the next interaction, and the inevitability of confrontation. I knew one thing for certain. My family had no idea how far I was willing to go to reclaim what was mine. Not just my money, not just my time, but my respect. And I wasn't about to let them underestimate me again. The next few days were surreal. I felt like I was living in a haze, going through the motions at work, talking to Lauren, and pretending like nothing had happened. But inside I was simmering. Every time I thought about the brunch, the retirement party, the text from Mom, or Ethan's smug little grin, a wave of frustration washed over me. I realized something crucial. The problem wasn't just my family. It was me. I had spent years trying to earn their validation, silently hoping that if I worked hard enough, behaved politely enough, stayed quiet, they would finally see me. But the truth was painfully obvious now. They weren't capable of seeing me. And worse, they didn't want to. I hit rock bottom that week. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but quietly, alone, in the small apartment Lauren and I shared. I stayed up late at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every slight, every family gathering where I had been minimized. I thought about my life and what I wanted it to be, and the comparison to Ethan gnawed at me relentlessly. I asked myself, repeatedly, is this really who I am? Someone who always takes a back seat while someone else collects the rewards? The answer was clear, and it stung. No, I refused to let this define me anymore. But for the first time in years, I admitted to myself that the change couldn't come from talking, it had to come from action. I began small. I revisited my finances, my career plans, my personal goals. I realized I had buried my potential under years of silent compliance. At work, I started volunteering for projects that truly mattered to me, projects that required real initiative and leadership. I took courses online to strengthen skills I had neglected: negotiation, project management, even some business strategy modules. Every step, no matter how small, was a reminder that I could create opportunities for myself without relying on anyone's approval. I wasn't just rebuilding confidence. I was quietly accumulating leverage, power I could use later. Lauren was a lifeline through this period. She didn't just support me emotionally. She challenged me in ways that were uncomfortable but necessary. Ryan, you've spent so long playing by their rules. Maybe it's time you start writing your own, she said one night as we sat on the couch, half-eaten takeout between us. Her words hit me harder than anything I'd heard from my family. Writing my own rules. Not for them, not for validation, but for me. It became my mantra. I also started cutting out distractions and people who reinforced the narrative that I was the lesser sibling. Casual acquaintances who had always echoed the family sentiment, commenting on Ethan's charm, Ethan's career, Ethan's natural talent, suddenly felt toxic. I realized I didn't need their approval, either. I needed to build momentum in silence. So I quietly refused favors, politely declined invitations that were more about observation than genuine connection, and spent my time strategically. The first real victory was subtle but satisfying. I had been working on a side project, a small financial consultancy idea I'd been sketching for months. It wasn't huge, nothing flashy, but it was mine. I quietly secured my first few clients, handling contracts, planning strategy, and seeing tangible results. For the first time in years, I felt competent in a way that had nothing to do with comparison or approval. Ethan would have dismissed it as insignificant, and maybe to him it was. But to me, it was proof that I could create my own successes, ones that didn't need family recognition to be valid. And while I was building, my family continued their usual pattern, blissfully unaware of the shift. Dad sent me a congratulatory text about a minor work anniversary, followed immediately by an announcement about Ethan's latest achievement. Mom called daily, updating me on Ethan's activities, subtly implying I should do more. Every conversation was a reminder of the stakes, and yet, for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. I began to see these interruptions not as criticisms, but as fuel. They were underestimating me, as they always had, and I realized that was a luxury for me to exploit later. One night, after a particularly grueling day juggling clients and planning outreach strategies, I looked at myself in the mirror and realized something. I was changing. Not just in confidence, but in clarity. I no longer felt small, invisible, or resentful in a way that consumed me. My anger had transformed into focus. My humiliation had become strategy. And my family, unaware of my efforts, were still playing the same old games, setting themselves up to be blindsided by the one person they had always overlooked: me. There was a particularly vivid moment of this transformation that I'll never forget. I was scrolling through my bank account after closing a significant deal for a client, a deal that required months of careful negotiation and planning. My balance, once modest and easily overlooked, was now steadily climbing. I thought about Ethan, who had called Mom earlier that week asking for more money for a business idea, and how casually she had assumed I'd be the one to fund it. I smiled quietly to myself, not out of malice, but because I realized I was no longer bound by their assumptions. They had made themselves predictable, and predictability is a dangerous thing when wielded strategically. As the weeks turned into months, my professional network grew quietly but steadily. I started documenting every achievement, building a portfolio of accomplishments that I knew would one day speak louder than any speech or party applause. I began researching investments, properties, and opportunities to grow my personal wealth independent of my family. Each success, no matter how small, was a brick in a foundation that they couldn't touch or diminish. The irony was delicious. I was building the life they thought I couldn't have, while maintaining the calm exterior of someone they still assumed was inconsequential. But even as I focused on growth and self-worth, the family continued their antics. Invitations came for dinner, brunch, and casual weekend visits, each loaded with subtle digs, comparisons, or assumptions. Ethan would casually mention how he had helped Dad with retirement planning, or how Mom had relied on him for some minor task. Each instance was like a test. Would I react emotionally, as in the past, or would I maintain my composure? And each time, I surprised myself by staying calm, letting the bait dangle without snapping. I was learning patience, and I realized that my quiet power might be more effective than any heated confrontation. Then, one evening, a particularly shocking betrayal occurred, one that would mark the true turning point in my journey. I had just returned from a client meeting and found a package waiting on the kitchen counter, addressed in Mom's handwriting. I assumed it was something minor, a gift, a note, maybe even a forgotten item from a recent gathering. But when I opened it, my heart sank. Inside was a copy of a contract, signed and notarized, transferring partial responsibility of my personal investments to Ethan without my consent. My chest tightened, a cold shock running through me. My own family had overstepped in the most audacious way yet. I sat there, staring at the papers, feeling a rush of anger, disbelief, and clarity all at once. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had tried to exploit me, assuming I would comply quietly as always. But this time, I knew I wouldn't. This time, I had the knowledge, the resources, and the patience to respond in a way that wouldn't just defend me. It would ensure they understood, finally, that I was no longer the sibling they could manipulate. As I folded the papers back into the envelope, I realized something. The fall had been necessary. The humiliation, the favoritism, the endless comparisons, it had all prepared me for this moment. I wasn't just rebuilding myself. I was preparing for the moment when I would rise, strategically, deliberately, and with consequences that my family would never forget. And I knew that moment was coming. The storm had begun to gather, and for the first time, I welcomed it. The weeks after I found the contract felt like the calm before something that might finally storm. I didn't want fireworks. I wanted precision. I'd burned through anger and come out the other side with a plan-shaped coolness I hadn't known I had. The discovery of those papers had been audacious, and it left me with two clear objectives. Make sure my assets were untouchable, and make sure the people who tried to steal from me, intentionally or by careless assumption, couldn't get away with it. There'd be no public spectacle unless it served a purpose. I wasn't interested in anger for its own sake. I wanted correction, consequence, and a final ledger that read, "You were wrong about me." The first person I told in detail was Lauren. I'd already leaned on her for emotional support, but now it was practical. She's meticulous, unflashy, and she hates unfairness on principle. We sat at our tiny kitchen table while she read through the photocopies I'd made of the contract. The apartment hummed with the quiet noise of late-night traffic and the kettle cooling on the stove. "This is fraudulent," she said flatly, sliding the papers back toward me. Her jaw was tight in that way she gets when she's pivoting from worry to action. "You need a lawyer and a forensic accountant. And you need to make sure nothing else is moved." I could hear the firmness in her voice, the kind of voice that makes uncertainty stop mid-step. I called Maya the next morning. Maya and I had worked together on a corporate audit a year earlier. She's brilliant with paper and patience, and she doesn't suffer fools. When she picked up, she sounded like she'd been expecting disruption, half apology, half readiness. I explained the situation quickly but precisely. She asked the right questions. Who signed it? When? Was there a notary? Could I produce the originals? I answered as best I could, even admitting the one embarrassing truth I'd been avoiding. I hadn't confronted Mom directly. Pride and calculation had kept me from turning the discovery into drama. I didn't want them to know I knew until I had them where I needed them. Maya agreed to represent me and recommended a forensic document examiner. "We'll need to compare signatures and look at the notary stamps," she said. "If there's even a hint of tampering, we'll have leverage." I felt oddly elated. Leverage was a word that tasted like possibility. The next ally I recruited was more unofficial, Trevor, a former colleague who now ran a boutique financial advisory. He'd always respected my competence in quiet ways, and we'd shared lunchroom strategies for career maneuvers. I walked into his office one afternoon, palms sweating slightly despite the calm I'd cultivated, and told him the story straight. Favoritism, forged paperwork, the works. He didn't blink. We'll secure your accounts and set up custodial protections, he said. If someone tries to redirect or withdraw funds, we'll have alerts and legal holds in place. He asked for nothing dramatic in return, just to be in the loop. His presence made me feel less like a cornered animal and more like someone building a defense. There was another dimension to consider: information. In families, gossip and narrative are currency. Ethan's charm had always bought him credit. People heard what he wanted them to hear. So I hired, discreetly, a private investigator named Alina. She wasn't an expensive hire. I'd built enough to be careful with money, but this was worth it. Alina's reputation was for quiet diligence. She didn't flirt with sensationalism. She collected facts and tied them into tidy, inescapable threads. I told her what I wanted: proof of collusion, proof that signatures had been forged or that conversations had taken place where my consent had been presumed and recorded in writing. I don't want gossip, I told her. Give me paperwork and witnesses. She nodded, and I felt the plan begin to feel less like wishful thinking and more like a machine. While the legal and financial scaffolding was being put into place, I started playing the long game socially. This wasn't about burning bridges for theater, it was about control. I continued to accept family invitations, politely, deliberately, because leaving would have fed the narrative that I was flighty or fragile. I showed up calm, patient, and observant. I made a point of being gracious in public, but I also recorded details in a private ledger: dates, comments, who said what, and the witnesses. I became the archivist of things they assumed were ephemeral. It felt oddly empowering to be the only one who seemed to remember the exact phrasing of a humiliating aside or the timeline of a decision. Memory, documented, is proof. Proof is leverage. Small tactics started stacking up. I quietly changed passwords and added two-factor authentication to accounts I controlled. I placed beneficiary clarifications where it made sense. Trevor put transactional alerts on anything of consequence. Maya filed a freeze notice with the trust manager as a precaution while the investigation into the contract was underway. These were the kinds of small, invisible moves that would matter when the moment of confrontation arrived. I didn't want to give the family the chance to engineer a preemptive defense, but I also wanted them to keep playing the same game. In my head, I sketched scenarios: what Ethan would do if he suspected leverage, how Mom might react if I asked for an explanation, how Dad might split. Predictability is powerful when you know the moves. I knew, for instance, that Ethan's impulse would be to charm, to deny, and to rely on the family's reflexive sympathy. He'd act wounded if accused. Mom would oscillate between disbelief and defensiveness. Dad would try to avoid confrontation with either of us until it became impossible. I needed them to follow their pattern, because patterns are the easiest things to dismantle when you have documentation and witnesses. So I laid an enticement. Nothing illegal, nothing cruel, just a carefully placed opportunity one knew Ethan couldn't refuse. Ethan likes quick wins. He likes the appearance of success with minimal effort. I created, with Trevor's help, a seed, a plausible-sounding investment opportunity that I was considering, but left intentionally vague in public contexts where my family could overhear. I made sure it had all the right markers: an enticing sector, a believable risk profile, a sense of urgency. I mentioned it casually in conversations where Mom tended to report back every detail to Ethan. I let the rumor leak through the family grapevine in a way that would reach him with the right spin. The idea wasn't to entrap him in something illegal. It was to test his impulse control and to see who would step into the trap of presuming control over my affairs. Meanwhile, Alina was working through a list of actions that left me alternately grateful and sickened. She documented several suspicious interactions: phone calls, late-night visits. Not illegal on their face, but suspicious as threads. Most importantly, she found one small, damning detail: a scanned copy of the exact contract page, uploaded to a shared cloud folder with an account belonging to an email alias I didn't recognize. It was timestamped the night after the retirement party. The file's metadata was messy, typical, someone careless enough to upload without erasing traces. Alina smiled that tight, efficient smile when she handed me the printouts. Not conclusive on its own, she said, but it connects the timing and the distribution. Combine that with a certified handwriting analysis, and we have a story that looks like intent rather than accident. Maya arranged for the handwriting expert. The examiner called it within 3 days, several markers inconsistent with my signature and a pressure pattern that suggested tracing. There were notary anomalies, too, stamps that didn't align perfectly with the dates. The report was dry and clinical, but each sentence was a drumbeat in my chest. It wasn't vindication in the way people imagine. There was no triumphant trumpet, but a slow, mechanical confirmation that the contract wasn't simply a misunderstanding. Someone had tried to shift my financial responsibilities without my consent. The word forgery hung between me and the family like an accusation that would become impossible to ignore. I could have gone to Mom then, laid the reports on the table and demanded answers. I considered it. I imagined the scene. The kitchen light, the way she'd look when cornered, the stutter in her voice when the narrative she'd told herself finally fractured. But I wanted more than a confession. I wanted accountability and a set of consequences they could not rewrite with charm. I wanted the truth documented in official places where charm didn't work, courts, not living rooms. So the setup continued. I scheduled an innocuous family dinner at Dad's house, something Dad loved and Mom encouraged, and Ethan would certainly attend. No public shouting, only familiarity. I let it be an ordinary night, a stage set with candor and old songs. I knew that on that night, with the forensic report in my pocket and legal counsel quietly ready to act, choices would be made. I had a plan for how the evening might unfold. I would be calm, invite conversation, and when the right moment presented itself, I'd ask for the contract to be explained. If they lied, I'd introduce the expert report. If they confessed, I'd let Maya outline the legal steps and the protections I'd already placed. If they tried to deflect, I had the cloud metadata and Alina's log to pull them back. It was surgical, not theatrical. The goal was not to humiliate for pleasure. It was to establish a record that could not be rewritten by family myth. In private, I kept adding contingencies. I told Lauren exactly where everything was, what to do if things escalated, and who to call. I prepared statements for social media in case the family tried to shape a narrative publicly. I rehearsed the phrases I wanted to use, measured, factual, not emotional. I'd learned that the same charm that had elevated Ethan could also, in the right forum and exposed to the wrong kind of scrutiny, collapse like a house of cards. On the morning of the dinner, my stomach fluttered in a way that felt less like nerves and more like expectancy. I dressed simply. No show, no need to prove anything with attire. I arrived on time, greeted Dad with a steady smile, and sat across from Ethan, who was already in his comfortable posture of belonging. Mom fussed over plates like she always did, nostalgia and control braided together in the habit. Conversation moved in its usual orbit, weather, Dad's health, small complaints, and I let it. I listened. I watched Ethan's hands, the little tells he had when he was calculating. When he laughed, it was a practiced laugh meant to disarm. When he leaned in to speak to Dad, it was with that soft authority he'd learned to use to persuade. The moment I had been waiting for arrived not with drumroll, but with the softest of nudges. Dad, in his typical offhand way, mentioned something about investments, how he was glad to have family help, how Ethan had been so eager to help organize things. Ethan's smile was the same as always. Mom caught my eyes across the table and mouthed something like, "Be nice," with a look that said she still thought she could manage the narrative. I took a breath and asked, calmly, "About the investments, Dad, can you tell me exactly what you and Ethan discussed the night I left the party?" For a suspended second, there was silence. Ethan's fingers stilled on the rim of his glass. Mom's smile faltered into something that resembled a mask. I felt the room shrink and expand at once, like a held breath. This was it. The small, ordinary family dinner that was about to become the stage for choices none of them had expected to be forced to make. My palms were steady on the table. The folder with the forensic report in my jacket felt like a promise against my ribs. Ethan opened his mouth. Mom leaned forward. Dad shifted in his seat. And then my phone buzzed in my pocket. One new message, display lighting up with the sender's name. I slid my thumb across the screen to see who it was, and the words made the air go thin. I took care of it. Don't worry. The message on my phone was from Alina. Her timing was impeccable, as always. I took care of it. Don't worry. I slipped it into my pocket and gave a small nod to myself. Everything was in place. The groundwork, the evidence, the legal protections, the subtle bait. I was ready. What followed was a delicate orchestration, quiet and controlled, but lethal in its effectiveness. I started the evening calmly, as I always had, letting Ethan and my parents believe that nothing was different. Dad prattled on about minor retirements and trivial investments, and Ethan leaned in, waiting for the chance to flex his charm again. Mom hovered in that performative way she always did, arranging cutlery and offering thinly veiled advice, assuming I would either play along or remain silent in my predictable frustration. But this time, silence was my ally, not my weakness. I sipped my water and nodded politely, letting the normal rhythm of the evening continue while my mind ran through the final steps. I waited until after dinner, when the plates had been cleared and the wine glasses refilled with sparkling water for Dad. The moment was private enough, controlled enough, that the family's attention could not be redirected by distractions. I leaned back in my chair and spoke slowly, deliberately, making eye contact with each person in the room. About the investment discussions that happened the night of my father's retirement party, my voice was steady, calm. The pause stretched, long enough for Ethan to shift uncomfortably in his chair. Mom's smile faltered slightly. Dad's hands froze on the table. I received copies of the contract you discussed, which transfer part of my financial responsibilities to Ethan. I continued, sliding the folder across the table. Except I never signed them. And according to a certified handwriting analysis and a review of the notary stamps, these documents are not authentic. They were uploaded without my consent, and evidence shows that the timing coincides with actions taken by people in this room. I kept my tone calm, measured, neutral even, but each word landed like a hammer. Ethan's smile wavered. Mom gasped softly. Dad's hand twitched as if he wanted to stop me mid-sentence. I opened the forensic report and laid it on the table for all to see. This is factual. This is verifiable. And it's only part of the evidence I have prepared. I leaned in, deliberately calm, and let the moment settle in. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the distant clink of glasses from a neighbor's party outside. Mom tried to interject. Ryan, this must be a misunderstanding. I held up a hand, polite but firm. No, Mom. There is no misunderstanding. And I want to make sure it's clear. Any assumption that I would comply quietly, that I would be silent, or that my consent could be implied, is incorrect. Everything you have done to manipulate this family's perception of my actions is now documented. Dad leaned forward, hesitant. Ryan, we didn't realize. Didn't realize? I repeated, voice calm but edged with steel. Dad, you were part of the discussions. You encouraged Ethan. You praised him for initiative that was not his alone. And yet, when actions crossed into legal territory, when someone tried to shift control over my finances, suddenly it's we didn't realize. Ethan's posture changed entirely. The confident lean, the casual gestures, they vanished. His voice came out clipped, uncertain. I didn't mean. You didn't mean? I echoed, letting the incredulity hang. Ethan, the evidence shows that you requested and accepted control over assets that were not yours, using documents that are demonstrably fraudulent. Your intentions are irrelevant. The fact remains that actions were taken in bad faith, and that is what matters. I watched as the realization sank in. Mom's face had gone pale, her hands tightening on the table edge. Dad's fingers drummed nervously. And Ethan finally understood that charm and smug smiles would not protect him here. For the first time, in a family gathering where he was accustomed to being the hero, he was stripped of his narrative. He sat there, silent, a small knot of panic building at the back of his throat. I allowed a pause for effect, and then I added, quietly but with unflinching resolve, I have already secured my assets. All investments, accounts, and documents are protected, and any attempt to interfere will be met with legal action. The contracts you assumed would manipulate me, nullified. Any further actions to attempt control will be recorded and used in court if necessary. And for the record, I've already spoken to my lawyer and financial advisor, and they are prepared to act immediately. The weight of my words finally broke the illusion of control that had been Ethan's shield for years. He opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. Mom shook her head, whispering, "Ryan, we thought you would. You thought I would let it slide?" I said evenly. "That's what everyone in this family has assumed for decades. And that's the lesson here. Assumptions are dangerous, especially when they underestimate me." The silence stretched, unbroken, heavy with tension. Then, almost imperceptibly, Ethan's face shifted. For the first time, I saw vulnerability. Not defiance, not charm, not manipulation, just fear and disbelief. Mom, too, looked exposed. Dad was unsteady, as if the foundations of his perceptions were cracking. And I realized, the calm I had maintained, the slow preparation, the patience, all of it had created an environment where they could see me for what I was, without my needing to raise my voice or dramatize anything. I allowed a small, controlled smile. "This isn't about punishment," I said, deliberately soft. "It's about clarity, about accountability, about establishing a reality that cannot be rewritten by charm, smiles, or assumed compliance. You wanted to see me as someone inconsequential, as someone who would fade into the background. That assumption is no longer true. And I wanted you to understand that before any action is taken." Mom blinked, swallowing hard. "Ryan, I held up a hand again. "No explanations. No justifications. The facts are on the table. You'll notice, moving forward, that I operate differently. That respect is earned, not assumed. That boundaries exist whether you choose to acknowledge them or not." Ethan's jaw tightened, his usual smirk gone. He looked at Dad, seeking rescue, and Dad met his gaze and slowly shook his head. There was no rescue here. The narrative had shifted. For decades, Ethan had been the favorite, the one who could charm and manipulate with impunity. That night, the script was rewritten. And then, quietly, I closed the folder, leaned back in my chair, and felt a sense of calm unlike anything I had experienced in years. The storm of frustration and humiliation, the years of being minimized, had culminated in this precise, quiet triumph. I had not yelled. I had not humiliated for spectacle. I had not needed allies to shout over the room. I had executed a plan, piece by piece, strategically, and it had worked. The fallout was subtle but undeniable. Mom and Dad spoke in hushed tones for the rest of the evening, their usual ease replaced with awareness of their misjudgment. Ethan, who had always been cocky and self-assured in any family setting, sat quietly, occasionally glancing at me with a mix of fear and incredulity. Even when Dad tried to resume casual conversation, the tension lingered. They were all aware, in a way that could not be undone, that they had miscalculated. After everyone left, I stayed behind for a moment in the now empty dining room, the night quiet except for the distant hum of city traffic outside. Lauren came in and sat beside me, her hand on my arm. "You did it," she said softly. I smiled, not triumphantly, but with the satisfaction of precision. "No theatrics, just reality," I said. I knew this was only the beginning of a new dynamic. The family would adjust, yes, but they would not forget. I had re-established control, not through confrontation alone, but through patience, preparation, and measured action. The lesson was clear. I was no longer the sibling they could dismiss, ignore, or exploit. I was visible. I was prepared. I was untouchable in ways they had assumed impossible. As I finally stood and turned off the lights, the silence in the house felt like a declaration. No words needed to be said. The power had shifted, and it was undeniable. For the first time in my life, the family who had underestimated me understood exactly who I was, and exactly what I was capable of. And in that quiet, empty room, I allowed myself a small, private smile. The game had changed. The tables had turned, and I was finally free.